I'm going to spend some time on this video going over some of the ideas presented in that excerpt at the end of the syllabus on Pedagogy the Oppressed about some ideas that Freire has. Now, I want to begin by just stating that Freire's approach, or what he calls critical pedagogy, is a very difficult approach to undertake in an online class. But I believe so much in this approach that I'm going to try to find ways to incorporate ideas or aspects of critical pedagogy into the assignments that you're required to do for this class. Now, Freire was this Brazilian educator who was working with the peasant class when he came up with this idea of critical pedagogy. And what he started to understand working with this illiterate underclass group of people in Brazil is that education needed to be more than obtaining literacy, high rates of literacy, or acquiring job skills for an occupation. He started to see that part of his working with this peasant class is the idea that education should be an act of liberation. That you should instill knowledge in such a way that it acts to liberate people from their oppression or liberate people from their involvement in the oppression of others. So he saw education as not only obtaining literacy or obtaining the job skills you need for a good job, but as important, the idea that education should be an act of liberation, presented in such a way that you liberate yourself from your own oppression and you liberate yourself from your involvement in the oppression of others. To me, this is what I also have come to believe about education. Now, part of this idea and a process that he talks about starts off with the idea of literacy. Literacy is more than teaching someone to read. I'm going to teach you to read today. I'm going to teach you how to read. He tries to get us to understand that teaching people to read, to be able to read a sentence, to understand or comprehend the meaning or what that sentence is trying to say, and to reply or regurgitate that information on an exam inhibits people's ability to see education as an act of liberation. He tries to break us down is that when we're doing the reading, and this is what I want you to try to understand in the readings that you'll be doing in this class, he posits this idea of reading of the word and reading of the world. That the idea that the articles that you read don't exist in isolation of the world. That they have a relationship to the real world. And this is what I'm going to be asking you to look at, is at this kind of relationship. The relationship it has to the real world. We also are going to start looking at the relationship that occurs in the act of reading itself. In the act of reading, there are three relationships that interconnect with one another. The writer, the narrative or the words, and the reader. The writer exists in society in a certain way. Whatever is written exists in society in a certain way. And who is ever doing the reading exists in society in a different way. So this reading of the word and reading of the world is to bring in what happens in the act of reading itself. So it's the reading of the word in relationship to the world. So what I'm asking you to do with this reading is not just understand the main concepts and ideas presented by these writers, but to do so in such a way that you stop and think what this means to you and how you see the world. I'm not looking for you to simply regurgitate this information on your midterm and final exam. I'm looking for you to see or to learn how to read. What does this stuff mean to you? What does it say about our world? How does it affect who we are and how we relate to the rest of the world? So don't go into these readings thinking they're just going to be something you're going to want to regurgitate on a midterm or final exam. And every reading, and they're not that long, so you have, I hope you have time to do it. But to reflect back on them, to think about the significance. Do you agree with these ideas? Do they help you understand who you are, or or how you're seen in the world, or how the world works at all, or how the world works? This type of literacy leads to what he calls authentic thinking. And he defines authentic thinking as the type of thinking concerned about reality. And if you're only doing these readings because you want to pass this class to get the degree or to be able to finish college or you get the job you want, Freire would argue you're limiting your understanding. You're lowering your expectations of who you are, or you're lowering your expectations of yourself as a person. So he wants you to move into this type of authentic thinking, the thinking that is concerned about the reality, in order to become transformers of the world. This is that liberation aspect of education. To sit there and sit through this class and not internalize some of these ideas in such a way that you begin, even if it's among your friends and families, to eliminate the discrimination, to eliminate the power inequalities that exist, is what's important for Freire in this idea. And I think in particular, classes like this with American and minority ethnic studies, women's studies, sociology, I think we all want this from our students. In order for this to happen, Freire says at the outset that the teacher-student contradiction must end. The separation between student and teacher has to be eliminated. He wants to replace student-teacher, students-teacher, and teacher-students with the new term, students-teachers, teachers-students. That it is an approach that we all learn from one another. Online class is going to be really difficult. In my face-to-face class, students often comment that one of the things they like about the class is hearing other people's ideas, opinions, or personal examples. That they learn from these things. They come to a better understanding of the topics that we're addressing in class. Well, that really can't exist except within the Twitter post in an online class. So we can never fully move to the type of environment that Freire wants us to do. We also can't move to this kind of environment because ultimately I'm the one who assigns the grades. Now you have the right and the ability to appeal any grade. I also have the right and the ability to say no to any of your appeals. So that access to power, since I have the power to determine the grade that you receive in this class, maintains a separation between teacher and student. Take out grading, it allows for this it allows to end this contradiction, this separation between student and teachers more effectively. Next, I want to talk about the idea of the two type of educational approaches that he's mentioned in these excerpts. One is called the banking concept of education, and the other is called the problem-posing concept of education. Now, with the banking concept of education, my role as a professor, my role as a teacher, is to assume that each and every one of you is an empty vault, and that I make to determine by myself what is important information and once I choose what information is important, I deposit that into you, what he calls the empty vault. So again, banking concept of education is this belief, this assumption that the professor sees the student as an empty vault, that he or she deposits the information he or she determines is important into that empty vault. What we are talking about here is the lecture class. Those classes many of you have sat through, that you walk in, you pull out your notebook, maybe pull out your notebook, and you take down notes. You take down what the professor is saying. This would be considered the banking concept of education. He says that one, it inhibits dialogue. If the professor is the only one who's talking, well, of course it inhibits dialogue. We never get to do, or we never get to hear, or do we ever ask to hear the opinions of students. It stifles creativity. You have a choice, Ferrari talks about, to be able to engage with the material, but your choice is really limited to classifying and categorizing the information to be regurgitated on an exam. That isn't creative thought. That's mechanized thought. That's rote memory. Ferrari's trying to get us to understand that this banking concept of education is based on this rote memory approach and therefore inhibits or stifles any type of creative thought. You just do what people tell you to do. You think what is important, what people tell you is important. That you maintain this empty vault subjectivity that people continue to deposit or dump information they deem as important into you. It inhibits self-reflection. It isn't asking you to stop and do this reading of the world, how this material, how this information affects your life, how it affects you, or how it affects the way people react to you. And finally, it's a violent act. I believe the banking concept of education is a violent act because it assumes that the students have no subjectivity. It robs you of that subjectivity and replaces that subjectivity with an empty vault. Anytime a person's subjectivity is taken from them, with or without their consent, with or without their knowledge, I see it as a violent act. Now, on the other hand, he produces or brings up what he calls the problem-posing concept of education. The type of education that at the beginning assumes that each and every one of you has a subjectivity. That if I was to ask you to write a definition of race, gender, class, or subjectivity, you could give me a definition of these four ideas. That if I ask you to give me a personal example of your relationship to, say, to gender, or to class, or to sexuality, you could write an example, a personal experience of that relationship. So problem posing, unlike the banking concept, assumes at the very outset that each and every one of you has a subjectivity. It encourages dialogue. In this ending of the separation between teachers and students, I am to engage in a dialogue with my students that allows us to both learn. Now, what I've come to understand in this idea of encouraging dialogue, it doesn't mean that I'm supposed to allow the students to stay in my face-to-face class to say whatever they want to say because that's their opinion. That isn't what Ferrari's asking me to do. My job is to get students to question their opinions, to challenge them. If they believe something, I want to know why. And if they say why, I want to know, have you thought about these other ideas? How do these things influence your opinion? So my role as the professor in the problem-posing concept of education is just that, to pose problems to ask you questions, to challenge your ideas, to get you to broaden your understanding, to get you to look at the complexities of any opinion that you have. Next, it promotes creativity. Since you're not just about rote memory or regurgitation of facts, it's about creative thinking. It's about being able to take an idea and expand on it, bring your own little twist to it, to bring in something that's never been done before, or people may not have an understanding, and you're able to make people understand it clearer. So it promotes creativity. It promotes critical self-reflection. Part of the authentic thinking, the aspect of it concerned with reality, is how it concerns your relationship to reality. So part of this problem-posing concept, and this is what I do with my writing assignments, and why it's so heavily based on self-reflection, is for you to reflect back on what this information means to you. And it's a liberatory act because it's premised upon incorporating a student's subjectivity, not erasing or eliminating the student's subjectivity. Like I said before, I have to assume at the outset that each and every one of you has a subjectivity, and that is the basis of your knowledge. That's your beginning point, your starting point in looking at this class. To do this in an online class is going to be difficult. And since this is my first online class, it's going to be even more difficult, and it can never replace the face-to-face class. But I think you'll see in the writing assignments and in the Twitter posts that there is some attempt to this. So in conclusion, what I want to sit here and say is that this type of approach, this critical pedagogical approach, this critical teaching philosophy, is something that I truly, deeply believe in. And I'm trying to use that into this online class. But there is a responsibility for you as students, meaning that you have to engage in the material. You have to think about the material, not simply read it while you're sitting on a toilet or taking time up in between TV shows or at the end of the night before you go to bed. To think about this information, to wonder what it means to you. What are the main points? Are they valid? Do they make sense to you? If so, why? If not, why not? Engage with this material. That's your responsibility in this class.